Hi everyone and welcome to Practical Inclusion. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I broadcast to you from today, which is the Yalukit Willam clan of the Boon Wurrung people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Gloria, thank you so much for coming on today. Are you able to, before I get you to tell us your story, let us know whose lands you're broadcasting in from today?
Yeah, sure. So I am on Gandagara people's land, which is the Darug Nations, and I also work and play on Gadiga land as well. So I pay my respect to anyone here on live with us for your past, your elders, present and future. Thank you for your beautiful country to be here.
Thank you. And as I said, thank you so much for coming on today. For those who are watching live or on the replay, please feel free to use the comments as usual and generate some conversation. And also if you have questions, stick them in the comments there and I'll bring it up onto the screen and we'll ask Gloria your question. Today's conversation is totally so important for us to be having, particularly in light of recent events, but not just particularly now, because always we're really not talking anywhere near enough about racism. And people have heard me say this before on this show, we're not talking about racism, we're still talking too much about cultural diversity in the workplace and unconscious bias. And I'm so love when I come across people like Gloria who are actually, really speaking the truth in this area and providing support, awareness and education to all of us as well to help us be better and do better. So I feel really privileged to have today's conversation with Gloria. And Gloria, I'd love for you to introduce yourself through story, as I usually get guests to do, and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to doing this type of work that you're going to talk about today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me, Bree. It's quite like we were talking backstage. It's great to have spaces for people like me to be able to talk about our work and who we are. So your platform inviting me here today has been incredible. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. So I am a Black African woman. I came to Australia many, many years ago. In fact, I have lived in Australia longer than my country of birth. And so it's interesting when we are talking about who's Australian and who's not. I've actually lived here longer than my country of birth. And it is a beautiful country, beautiful people. I sort of walk between two cultures. So my children's father is white Caucasian and my husband is Caucasian. And so this chat around racism is really important to me. I walk between both cultures and it means so much to me. I want to see Black people prosper. I want to see white people prosper in a safe environment wherever we are. And so this space, this work that I do is very personal. So I thought I'll let your audience know it's not about an angry Black woman having, a swipe about European culture and domination. It's about someone who's invested a lot of time and love for both cultures. So they both mean so much to me. At the same time, it's important that we hear those on the receiving end of racism, because otherwise we are not learning. And I have got a very successful family, beautiful, beautiful family who I wouldn't swap for anything. But we come from two different cultures. And so, if my partner came here right now, he looks completely different to me, but we work well because there's understanding, there's clear communication and respect, and that's what we can emulate in wherever we are, as long as we want to do that. So, I came here, I've done adult education here in this country. But what struck me after my undergraduate and looking for work was a completely different scenario. I had a beautiful life in university where cultures come together. But as soon as I started to look for work into the world of work, that was completely different. And I think that's where I really started experiencing racism in this country. And that was a shock to my system, because up until that time, university life has been quite beautiful. And, you know, I met my husband there on a university campus, and we kind of involved in so many things together, sports, debating, everything. And there was never a time I felt I didn't belong. But it changed quickly when I moved into the world of work, and that never made sense to me. So where I live, beautiful Darug Nation in the Blue Mountains, I've been involved in many community projects and community activity. I am the president of PNC for a high school over there for many years, and I served in the executive for many, many years. So, you know, I have a group of very active parents in the school, and I lead that group. And I've had no problems at all ever once feeling that I didn't belong or I wasn't listened to. But it was such a different when I moved from community being a leader into workplaces where you were dismissed, always dismissed, highly scrutinized about my work and my competence. So many things were sort of quite different. And so I started to look into it. Why is it that I'm so being treated differently in this space? And when I started to do research into Black history, and that's what things started to make sense to me. So the society is structured this way. Aha! So it's not always just about us and who we are. It's the way in which the society is structured, and that places a lot of stress onto our lives and the way that we view wherever space that we are in. It could be the sporting field or education. That's just how we view, and it started to make sense. So there's a structure in place that's been built many, many years ago to continue this narrative. And so I moved from the workplace into learning more. And I never, ever consider myself to be a researcher in this age. You know, I'm not young, and it's interesting. It's become my life now, because I wanted to understand why Black people are treated the way that we are, and that I didn't see, for example, Black professors in universities that I was in, not that many. And how come there's not a Black dean? I don't think that there is actually a Black dean in Australia. And so it was just trying to find out and then really going deeper into things. And that has been a real journey of years of trauma, years of abuse, years of racism, and the thing is that when we talk about racism, people often think that it's the slurs and the name callings on the street, but it's not. It's more than that. It's the way society is structured to keep some people below the line. So if there's a line of where people are situated in life, and that's where you're placed, then you're placed there. It doesn't matter how much education that you have under your name, you're placed there. And that's why Black, even doctors, still experience racism in their work. So I better leave it there. I'm sure you have questions to ask me.
Oh, so many of that introduction for sure.
It's a long one.
We talk often about the structure, and how exactly is what you were describing then, that it keeps people down and keeps people in a place. It's really hard to translate that idea to people who haven't researched the history and who don't live and experience racism on a daily basis. And so I know this question doesn't particularly have a great answer at this point in time, but what are the types of things that you think we can do when we are engaging with people in workplaces to try and get them to understand that it is the structure and not everybody has these equal access to opportunity?
Thank you. That is a great question, because we can't downplay the seriousness of racism with bias training. And I talk a lot about that on LinkedIn, is that racism is something that's been upholding for several years to oppress people. And so when we reduce it into changing people's behavior through conscious and unconscious bias training, it diminishes it and you put the ownership on people's behavior. But racism is not just people's behavior. It's about the structures in place, the structures that stops Black person getting a job, for example. So if we really want to do something in our organizations, it's about looking at how even we advertise positions, for example, how recruitment is done, how training is done, and looking at even retention of when we have employed Black people into our institutions or in our workplaces. Are we able to retain them? And if we are not, why not? What is in place that's stopping them? So you see how it changes the conversation from someone's attitude, which is bias training, and changing, how I'm being referred to. Is it a he or she, which is important, but that's not what keeps Black people on the disadvantage. What keeps Black people on the disadvantage is the structure in place, so that Australia is historically a racist country. It doesn't make white people racist. It's the way that the country is structured. And so, people can get offended by talking about racism if we start really educating people that it's not you as a person that's racist, is the system in place. So if you really want to do something about changing and dismantling that system, then understand how the system operates. I hope that makes sense. So that it removes the ons from people's behavior onto the structure that is operating. And that's what the problem is. Individual people can make pledges of not calling Black people names, of not being mean to Black people in the workplace. It will not change the racial structures in place. So if you really want to do something about that, talk to our HR department. We need to go to the root cause of racism and start dismantling it there. And that's why bias training doesn't help Black people. If anything at all, it's actually quite harmful, because companies are ticking the bias training box and saying, well, we are fine now. We've done our bias training. So, Black people are all right in our country, in our organization, but they're not. The system is still there. Let's look at how many Black people have moved through progression into promotion within your organization. Do you make space for them? And then we move into the issue of equality and equity. They're two different structures going. Equality looks at the fact that we are all needing a piece of apple. So we're going to give everyone a piece of apple. Then that's fair. But that doesn't take into account that perhaps someone needs something else to make the piece of apple valuable to them, because they're already starting from the back foot. And so we need to start moving from equality into equity. When we do equity in our training, it helps people up. It start making the playing field a little bit level for everyone, because we don't all start at the same level.
Exactly.
And that's the difference. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, I love the way you've articulated that. And I conduct surveys in organizations, and at the end of the survey there's a space, any further comments, and usually we ask a question about, do you support the organization's efforts in diversity and inclusion, and the percentage of answers where somebody says it's just about treating everybody the same, I don't believe in affirmative action. I think everybody should have access to the same opportunities. That attitude is still so prolific in the organizations, because we just, even people in and many people in HR still don't really fully understand the difference between equality and equity. And I'm with you. I think that's one of our biggest challenges, and that's a much more important concept to be training people on than bias.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And, once we can see that people are starting on the back foot and they perhaps need more support than other people, then equality makes sense. But right now, doing equality and bias training, even though it's important, I mean, we still need to look at the way in which we behave around people that are different to us, or people's gender and sexuality. That's still very important. I mean, the learning is never ending. But what I'm bringing to the conversation is that when we are having this conversation, we are still leaving our Black people behind, Black and brown people behind, because we haven't dealt with issue of equality. And so we need to bring that into the conversation. And that's what I'm trying to do in the book that I'm releasing in September. It's all about that. It's about bringing equality into the conversation of our DEI training. Otherwise, we are not really helping our Black and brown people. We are still on the back foot, and that's really hard. It affects us deeply. We lose careers. We can't progress. And as a society, if we really want to help in that space, which there's been a lot of talking, thank goodness, since George Floyd. And I mean, it doesn't have to take that extreme for us to really hear Black people, that someone being killed brutally on the streets, you see? So is my forefathers been talking about it? We are not the first people talking about it, and it's been ongoing. But right now, there's momentum around since his death, and what we are saying is, let's move the needle a little bit further. Let's really start dealing with equity in this training to help Black folks. Otherwise, the gap will continue to widen. We talk about not dwelling on history, because the history of oppression happened several years ago and is done and dusted. 400 years ago, we had slave trade. No one is doing slave trade now. So why are Black people still persisting on this? And what I would like people to know is that even though it happened a long time ago, its effects continue to affect our lives. And so Black people were viewed inferior back then. And guess what? We still do that now. And that's why look at the incarceration of First Nation people in this country. I mean, I had a talk with human rights lawyer recently in one of my podcasts. I was in tears listening to him. And George Newhouse, so he works with National Justice Project. And even in the justice system, the unfairness in that system and what's causing wrecking our First Nation people is really appalling. And this is what we are talking about, systems. So if people are going to get affected about us talking about racism and not wanting us to discuss this issue that happened long time ago, but it still continue to have effect on us, then we can't move on as a society. We cannot move on, you know, and so we don't like talking about it. It's traumatic for someone because it really opens up wounds when we talk about racism. But it's almost like because people are not listening, that's the only way to really bring it to people's attention. And so it's like we're continually discussing it, but we don't know how else to make it plain to people that racism continue to affect our lives right now in 2021.
Yep. Yeah. And we've got to just keep those of us who are those of us white people who are aware of this need to do as much as we can to keep raising this conversation and driving for those systemic changes that you speak of, because the reality is the people who hold the power at the moment are more likely to be white people, and we're the ones who are designing the recruitment processes and delivering the actually doing the hiring and the promotions and the rest of it. And if we're not immersing ourselves in this type of education and awareness that you're providing and doing our own research and thinking, then we're not going to change the system. It is on us to do that. Thank you so much for articulating that. You mentioned your podcast, and I put up a link before to your LinkedIn page. Voice Everyday Racism is its name. That's how I came across you, listening to one of the episodes on the podcast, and I was like, wow, this is what I need to be listening to. So for everybody out there, Voice Everyday Racism, if you search that on LinkedIn, you'll find Gloria in that podcast, which is definitely worth a listen. Gloria, there was one thing I did want to touch on before we wrap up. In the diversity and inclusion workforce in this country, it is still incredibly white. Whereas in the US, the diversity and inclusion workforce is not. There seems to be a large number of people of colour in the workforce, but we don't see that here. And obviously that has a lot of implications for the type of priorities and focus that is occurring in diversity and inclusion. But I'm interested in your take as to why that is. Now, I think there's two clear things in my mind that are driving this, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, you've really described it well, Bree, because our systems in Australia is white, even though we are a multicultural country. Don't get me wrong, we are very good, successful multicultural country. However, it's not reflected in leadership. And that goes in all areas of Australia's society. So unless we start valuing people of distinctively different in our organizations and support them into leadership, you won't see diverse DEI systems in Australia for many, many years, unfortunately. you know, I have to do it tough to be in that system. And there's a lot that I can't talk about, but it's taken me years to get to this space. Not forgetting the big hex deck that I've got in order to prove myself that I can do this work, which is quite frankly ridiculous. I've lived as a Black woman all my life. My lived experience is immense.
Yeah.
I'm now doing master's degree in order to be paid in this space. A lot of people that are doing bias training, and because I've done research on this, a lot of them don't even have undergraduate degree, but they're white. And
That's
so,
me. Yep, exactly. Exactly.
But you will get the job by going to an organization and presenting bias training. Then they will give me space to enter that space. That's just reality because I've got Black skin color. And the fact of that does not translate to the worth of knowledge that I actually bring in order to make systematic changes. They won't listen to me because they look at my face and that's it. I'm out. So that's what we're dealing with. And it's really difficult to break through that glass ceiling. Like for us, it's a cement ceiling to crack open. And that's what it is. And so unless people start listening to us and paying attention that what we actually have to say is valuable, we won't be able to change that conversation. And it's really hard. It's leaving Australia behind. But the thing I want to say to businesses and organizations is that if they don't cotton on with this conversation and do something about it, they're going to get called out. Millennials who are going to be the leaders of this country, I'm telling you, they are not going to put up with this shit that we have. Sorry to swear on your podcast.
Do it. Do it.
They will write about it. Do you know yesterday a 20-year-old contacted me because they saw an article written by Channel 7 about the footballers, the England 3 Black footballers. And they were knocking on my door about the article. So millennials who are going to be the leaders of this country are not going to put up with it. So it's best that organizations actually listen and start making changes because they're going to call them out. And look, what have we got? Social media. They will paste it on social media and they will say that your organization is racist and it's not doing anything to dismantle racism, and they're not going to work for you, and you're causing them harm, and they will write about it. So it's really up to organizations to start listening and putting systems in place to really rid themselves from racism systems and do something really do better.
Yeah. And I can totally agree with both your points there, because the surveys I see, it is the age groups under 30 who are hugely supportive of diversity and inclusion work and always sure that their organisation is not doing enough. So the data absolutely supports that statement. And I have seen, without a doubt, in my experiences in the diversity and inclusion space, I have seen people of colour get excluded from opportunities that they were way more qualified to take on than us white folk who stick up our hand and stick up and put our heads up and get those opportunities handed to us on a silver platter. So I totally, I think anybody who thinks that that's not happening is fooling themselves. Thank you, Gloria. We have to wrap up now, but that conversation has been incredible. I thank you for your frankness and for the, the personal toll that it takes stepping into this space. I know it's not easy for me stepping into the gender and sexuality space at times, because it has such a personal cost. But I can imagine that is totally amplified through the work that you're doing. So my hat goes off to you, and thank you so much for continuing to do this work and educate those of us who need it, who should have already educated ourselves much earlier, but taking us along that journey with you in such a beautiful way. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. And you're right, it's difficult and it takes a toll, but I wouldn't change it for the world. You know, people are beautiful, and it's my goal that everyone is given the opportunity to be the best self and to contribute to society and a sense of belonging. It is an inherent moral duty that we help people to belong, whoever they are. And so thank you for having me. I really appreciate you having me today.
Oh, beautiful ending statement. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. If you are keen to join the Diversity and Inclusion Network that I keep chatting on about, the next session is on Thursday, so you've got time to jump in. You can go to my website to see I'll just show it up there on the screen, to see the details of the network. This week, we're discussing the word inclusion. And we're going to try and unpack that a little, because we know that, it's not as simple as it sounds, but do we get too distracted when we start talking about the definition of inclusion rather than doing the structure and system work that we've been talking about today? So we'll have that chat, as well as every week we have networking and we have a Q&A and challenge sharing sessions. So please sign up if you're interested. We'd love to have you join us. Thanks again for listening in, and we'll catch you all next week.
Thank you. Okay. See you, everyone.